Welcome to the U.S. Homefront during World War II. Today we're going to talk about things that occurred internally in the United States and kind of the impacts of the war on the United States from roughly the years 1940-ish, 1941 to 1945. All right, so to start off, remember that as as World War II begins for the United States, it really ends the Great Depression. So as early as 1939, with the end of the Neutrality Acts, we have Lend-Lease, we have preparations, we have Congress appropriating money, close to $40 billion for the buildup of our military. To make sure that Britain can fight the war until we're ready to. Really, this signals an end to the Great Depression. And so we have a pretty fascinating era of prosperity that comes on the heels of the worst economic depression in American history. All right. Most of that depended on federal spending, in wartime industries that we're going to see to a large degree out in the West. So kind of the South and the West. And so we really want to understand that this is the rise of the Sun Belt. And, the Sun Belt still today, Southern California, Texas, and Florida especially, they've really become, not only large places in terms of population, but also politically powerful as well. And we need to understand that starts during World War II and the tremendous amount of defense spending for everything from shipbuilding to plane building, all sorts of stuff. This also is really the beginning of the rise in what we call the national debt. And we've never really recovered from that. Although Alexander Hamilton would probably argue that that's not a bad thing. That ties the wealthy to the success of the country and the government. And I mean, they're the ones that are owed the money, and so they have a vested interest in making sure that the government remains stable. So take from that what you will, if you think that's a bad thing or a good thing. But our debt has never been the same since. All right, now, along with the tremendous impact of growth on the West, we need to understand that not only that people are moving from rural areas to the cities, we also have the Great Migration still going on. And so it's during World War II that we start to see, some of the Western cities gain a large population of African Americans. We see this happen in Seattle and Portland and of course in places like LA and even Denver. In terms of labor, during the Great Depression, we had too many people and not enough jobs. Now we have the opposite problem. We have too many jobs and not enough labor. There's been a vacuum, just like there was in World War I, where, especially white males are being asked to fight in the war, and that leaves industrial, factories of whatever kind that had to do with the military, and we needed workers for that. And so, as you can probably imagine, into this vacuum is going to step in two groups in particular that you need to write down: women and African Americans, and that's going to have a tremendous impact on those groups moving forward, even after World War II. Now, to make sure that strikes did not happen, because they did, but to make sure that they didn't happen on a regular occurrence, the Smith-Connolly Act was passed, which basically gave the president, authority to shut down, to keep plants from shutting down, to prevent strikes from happening in any industry that was in some way related to military production. And there was even an example in, I think it was Sears Roebuck, where the CEO refused to do what the government wanted, and the military basically carried him out of his own building. So, from time to time, the government flexed this muscle whenever they needed to on whatever, because really the idea was, let's make sure that we keep production going. that we don't have interruptions of work of whatever kind. For the most part, both wages and prices were stabilized by the government, probably better than they were during World War I. And, that kept the economy going during this time. Okay, you can see the government spending. You can see the spikes during both world wars. Look at the one right before 1920. So these are the years really 1915 to probably about 1918. You can see that deficit spending by the government. And then, of course, that's dwarfed by what we see in World War II. But I think the big picture is the rise in government spending. Whereas, before the 1900s, especially after the Civil War, there was just a very rarely do we have the government doing any kind of deficit spending. And now we see that the health of the economy, to at least a decent degree, goes by what the government spends on, everything from producing electricity with dams to building planes and tanks, to whatever the case is. But you can see the overall effect is increased government spending, really from the early 1900s. All right, so much like they did in World War I, the government directed the economy to the degree that anything that could be used in any way, shape, or form for the military, and I mean, even as far as like things like coffee or sugar or gasoline or something like that, the government had an interest in it and how it was used for the military effort. They typically directed production of it or controlled where it went and where it got sent to. Okay, to keep inflation down, they created the Office of Price Administration. Not only did this fight regulation and try to keep prices down, but they also worked with industries and the War Production Board to keep wages up. And so it's not communism, but I mean, in a time of emergency, you kind of had to do that kind of system where you kept the wages up enough to keep the people from striking, but you also kept wages from skyrocketing, which they very well could have during this time, to make sure that people could still pay for things that they needed. All right, Office of Price Administration also created a system of rationing. So things like I mentioned, coffee, sugar, gasoline, those are all things that people were encouraged to try to use as little of as possible so they could be used for the military. The War Production Board really worked with various industries in America to like the Ford auto plant basically stopped making Fords for the civilian market and started making vehicles, of a military nature, tanks if they needed to. Boeing, for example, Boeing got a huge defense contract during World War II, and instead of making passenger airlines, now they were making bombers. So the War Production Board worked, pretty closely with major industries, helped the factories to retool. In some cases, paid for that retooling or subsidized it pretty heavily. And the industries like this because they knew they had a consistent buyer. This put people to work in their cities, and this is good for the economy. Next, how did we pay for the war? Well, again, very similar to World War I, if you can remember, kind of two ways. One was war bonds. Remember that a bond is an IOU. So the government basically just takes your money and then they give you a bond and says, in 15, 20, and a lot of times the ones that gave out the most interest were 30-year bonds. It was all right, give us your $1,000 in 30 years, you'll have $5,000 or whatever the case was. Give us your $10,000 and then you'll have $50,000. But that's how they paid for probably about half of the war, was by selling war bonds, and it became very patriotic to buy a war bond. So even the smallest war bonds were a contribution, but the other 50% they got from taxes. Now, the wealthy weren't taxed quite as much as they were during World War I. Really, the brunt of the taxation kind of went on the middle class for the most part. So a little bit different from World War I in that aspect. But that's how the war was paid for. The government went into debt by handing out these IOUs, these war bonds, and then they used tax revenues to cover the rest of it. As World War I, in a lot of ways, is kind of a repeat. But there was a lot of government, propaganda to gain support for the war. And so there were war bond drives. FDR was consistently doing fireside chats throughout the war, encouraging people, through their use of the radio to get out a map and to follow along and to see, these are the leaders involved. Here's Eisenhower, here's Patton, here's MacArthur out here, here's Nimitz, and this is what we're doing, and this is our objective, and follow along on your map. And it got people really interested in kind of this team effort aspect. So those fireside chats and the use of the radio, it is kind of interesting how all of the leaders between, Hitler was very effective early on in using the radio and had radios, basically subsidized or given out to every German so that they could hear Hitler's program. Mussolini kind of did the same thing, not to the degree as Hitler did in Germany. But then, by the 1930s, pretty much every American family, middle-class family at least, had a radio, and even people that didn't, there was enough to, families could share, or, public areas would have these radios, and they tuned in to hear what the president was going to say. There were also, war movies and clips that played in theaters where you could go in and watch. These things were probably less than a half an hour, but they would show, and usually in a positive American light, they would show, the Americans' cause, but then they'd also make the Germans, and especially the Japanese, they were just relentless on the Japanese, making the Japanese look less than human, savages, brutes, and just really racist against the Japanese. But these war movies and clips were designed to foster this American attitude, and hey, we got to rally together and do whatever we can against the enemy. And so they were very blue blood, patriotic films, and in a lot of ways very ethnically discriminating against our enemies. Scrap metal drives, so aluminum, steel, rubber. These were something that Americans proudly, a lot of kids even threw their toys in. I was telling one of my classes about how my dad was really little. I think he was about 4. And he says one of his first memories is taking his little toy soldiers that he had that were metal and putting them in the scrap drive, and, feeling all proud about that. So that was something that Americans did, to kind of rally that team support. Rationing, we mentioned gasoline, food, meat, coffee, sugar. People were encouraged to plant victory gardens. It wasn't quite the same as World War I, where they were calling, sauerkraut Liberty cabbage and, things like that. But still, people did grow things on their own so that the bulk of the stuff could go to our boys, or whatever the military effort called for. Slew of propaganda posters you can see here. I kind of like the loose lips sink ships and do less so they'll have enough. Rationing gives you a fair share, so the boys can have coffee. And then my favorite one here is the carpooling one. It says, if you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. So good stuff. Okay. All right. Let's move on to minority groups during the war. African Americans, there were, you could say, tremendous changes for African Americans. So first of all, let's start in the South. Remember that the Great Migration is continuing to go on, not only for African Americans to avoid prejudice and racism and Jim Crow laws and things like that, but also it is during this time that there's a mechanical cotton picker that is created, and there's just massive unemployment throughout the South. And so that's another push factor leading out of the South. Now, African Americans are going to continue to go to the North. So that is definitely true. They're going to go into St. Louis, into Chicago, and Detroit, Cleveland, and, as far up north as places like New York and Boston. But what we start to see, and I think what's interesting about this is that for the first time, we really start to see African Americans in large numbers go out to the West. And so the Sun Belt is going to get an influx of African Americans that are going to go to find any kind of factory jobs or any jobs that they can due to the big defense contracts that have been handed out to states in the West. Okay, some notable groups and people. You see the picture of A. Philip Randolph, who was the head of one of the most powerful African American unions in America, the sleeping car porters. I know that doesn't sound big, but because there were, at this time, the railroad was such a big way to travel across the country, and sleeping car porters were kind of like the people that handled all the bags and things like that. They had actually worked themselves into be a pretty powerful group. And then you combine that with, they're kind of, I wouldn't say associated with the NAACP, but they're kind of like the NAACP. And A. Philip Randolph was a charismatic leader for them and really pushed the government hard in terms of, hey, you need us during the war, and we want to be treated equally in the military and also in in industry. And so between people like that, A. Philip Randolph and Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR was kind of compelled to create a couple of groups that were at least kind of watchdogs to watch out for discrimination in terms of the military. And so we have, the FEPC and the CORE. So really the Fair Employment Practices Commission, that's the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices Commission. They watched out for discrimination in the hiring of factory workers and things like that. The CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, this is a group that we start to see that really develops probably more after World War II. But these two groups are going to be, I guess, kind of like the foundation for the civil rights movement that we're going to see in the 50s and 60s. And so these are kind of early groups for that. Really what African Americans hoped to obtain was what they called the double V. So double victory. So victory for war and then victory at home. And, even though maybe that didn't quite happen in World War II, we're going to see it start to happen as a result of World War II. These veterans of the war who put their lives out there, they're going to have a lot of just cause for wanting to have, rights reinstalled in the United States. And so what we would say is probably they weren't initially successful, but eventually they're going to have some success once the war is over. Probably the most famous African-American fighting group, because I think it's probably important for you guys to understand that at this time, and it won't be till after World War II, that the military is still very segregated. And the military, the government said we're going to segregate for the good of African Americans, so that they're not there's not hostility by the white people towards the black people within those government agencies, which is really just a bunch of crap. And so throughout the course of World War II, African Americans are fighting, and oftentimes very distinguished fighting, but in segregated groups. And probably the most famous of those groups was the Tuskegee Airmen, who were trained in Tuskegee, Alabama, and many of them had extraordinary tales and extraordinary, examples of bravery. So African Americans contributed mightily during World War II, and we're going to see that pay off at least to some degree as we get to the 50s and 60s as a result. Okay, Native Americans. Native Americans are an interesting group because they've been so discriminated against, like African Americans, but they have this amazing willingness to participate in the war effort. And so we do see, tens of thousands of Native Americans who either left the reservation to find jobs in factories, which they did, or even a number of them that fought in the U.S. Army. And probably the most famous of those were the Navajo Code Talkers. We've talked a little bit about how very early on we were able to break Japanese code, and we were able to figure out where they were going and what they were going to do, and that helped us out quite a bit. By the end of the war, we had also figured out the German codes, but one of the codes that was never broken was the Navajo Code Talkers, because they had just, it wasn't in code, it was just their language, and the Japanese had no idea what kind of language was being spoken because it was an indigenous language in the interior of the United States, and they just had nobody that spoke that language. And so, it was kind of a needle in the haystack to try to figure out what language they were speaking. So that was a pretty tremendous contribution by Native Americans. Also, it probably is important to understand too why many Native Americans were compelled to come fight in the war effort. And hey, there was a sense of patriotism to some degree, but also by 1943, most of the New Deal programs that had helped reservations, they had kind of been ended. And so they needed jobs and they needed, somewhere to go. And the military oftentimes provided an opportunity for that. Okay, Mexican Americans. So what we see for Mexican Americans is this is an era when the South and the West really begins to swell with Mexican Americans, kind of in a reversal of policy. Now the American government are encouraging Mexican Americans to come in. Most notably, I mean, some definitely worked in factories, but where we really see Mexican Americans fill the void of is as rural, say, Californians move to cities to find jobs in factory work. We have this void of labor, this vacuum of labor in the agricultural producing regions of California. And so, by way of what's called the Bracero program, I don't know if you guys remember in human geography talking about work programs or something like that, where we have these worker exchange. A Bracero program is probably the only time in the United States that we've ever had something like this, where we agreed to make sure that these people had transportation back and forth to Mexico, that they would get a decent wage, that they would be, there would be housing provided for these people to some degree. And then, the Mexican government, they would agree to only send the amount that we were kind of telling them to send. And then after the work was done, and the idea was after the war was over, that these people would go then back to Mexico after the work was done. And, to some degree, this kind of happened. But what we're going to see is that even after the war, many of the people that left the rural areas, they don't want to go back to agricultural work. And so Mexicans are going to come up and fill that void. It does lead to some racial and ethnic tension, particularly in places like Los Angeles and San Diego, where you have this mix of military presence and Mexicans that are coming in. And so we have the famous Zoot Suit riots. A Zoot Suit was kind of a flamboyant outfit for teenagers and early 20s, Mexican American boys, and it made them kind of stick out. And so you can see here these soldiers and off-duty sailors, they're carrying around sticks, and they end up going after, for several days, go after anybody in a Zoot suit that would be easy to identify. But anybody that was Mexican American, they went after them. So there was some racial tension as a result of this. All right, women. So women, 6 million women participated in the workforce during the war. The idea of Rosie the Riveter, you can see by this propaganda picture, women became, very ingrained into the American workforce. As a result of this, women served not in the military directly, but as support, as ancillary support. And so we have the WWIIs and the waves. The WWIIs in the Army and the waves in the Navy, where the women served as support for secretaries or whatever they needed in that particular capacity. Women worked on riveting lines. Here you can see in a Boeing factory, you have women that are working to put bombers together. And then, believe it or not, and I don't want you to think that the government was like hiring U.S. prostitutes or anything, because they weren't doing that. But the women did a lot of times. They were involved in what was called the USO, and the USO just basically either they brought the men to the USO, or the USO took the girls to where the men were, and then they had these dances. And so you can see a USO dance at the top right hand corner. And of course, there was supposed to be the women were supposed to dress appropriately, but the USO really pretty much hired good-looking girls, and so these girls were kind of meant to host the men before they went off to war and to give them a good time, whatever that meant. And but they were supposed to have rules of morality, but those things weren't always followed. And you could kind of say that these USO dances, in a way, were kind of the beginning of the baby boom. So kind of an interesting feature of our war effort, but the women trying to keep the morale up of the men. All right, probably the most ill-treated group of the American home front would be the Nisei, which are Japanese Americans, so American-born Japanese. After Pearl Harbor, FDR probably makes one of his biggest mistakes, in hindsight, and that is he creates an executive order called Executive Order 9066. And this basically took all of the Japanese, mostly in California, but some in Washington and Oregon, but mostly in California, and basically said to these people, look, you got until this amount of time, and by that time, you need to give up your property. If you have any money in banks, you need to give it up. And if you own a business, you need to sell it off or you need to give it up. And they basically took these people into the interior of the country. And the reason was that FDR said these people weren't safe and they were getting attacked. And so they were going to put them in the interior away from population to where they would not be, they would not be harmed. Well, as you can imagine, this is like putting people in quarantine in rural Wyoming or, rural Colorado. A lot of these places were just out in the middle of nowhere. And at first they were kind of like labor camps. I mean, they weren't concentration camps by any means, but there were a number of Japanese Americans that died. And the sad thing about this is these people were pretty loyal. I mean, they had lived in America, most of them, their entire lives. They were Americans. Now, they tried suing the American government in Korematsu versus United States. And this is, again, like we said, FDR making a huge mistake creating this executive order. The Supreme Court made a huge mistake in saying during the wartime, this is something that is okay. And it basically sanctioned the prejudice against Japanese Americans. Now, to show you the scope of how things had kind of changed, in 1943, the U.S. government repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. So at this time, the Chinese nationalists were fighting off the Japanese, and the Chinese nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, they were actually allies with the United States. And so we get rid of the repeal on the with the Chinese Exclusion Act, but yet then we discriminated against the Japanese. Now, eventually in 1983, to kind of end up the story, the United States government under Ronald Reagan ends up giving reparations to any of these internment survivors or their children. And so they gave them like $20,000 each, which, it's a nice gesture, but probably a lot of these people lost a lot more than that. So kind of a token gesture. But yeah, I'd say probably of any group that was discriminated against, the Japanese were by far the worst. Okay, last slide here. So by 1944, the Democrats have reelected or going to reelect. Again, you can see, just like in 1940, you can see the kind of the sectionalism there with the isolationists. These guys are voting basically against Roosevelt spending another term in office. By this time, Roosevelt is toward the end of his life. Really, the biggest thing is who Roosevelt is going to have as his vice president. Henry Wallace was his vice president as of 1940, but he had kind of angered, certain Southern Democrats and other people in his party. And so Roosevelt nominates a senator from Missouri as his running mate, a guy by the name of Harry Truman. And I make such a big deal of this because Truman is going to take over for Roosevelt when Roosevelt dies in April of 1944. Okay. And then Thomas Dewey is nominated as the Republicans. We're going to see him run again against Truman in 1948. All right. That is the end of the American Home Front. Thank you for tuning in.